Dr. Zakeera Docrat. I mean, you've mentioned so many things there. And I know that when you appeared on TV last year talking about the justice issues again with language in South African courts, I think it was the Senzo Meyiwa case where we had the judge, where he had to stop the proceedings so that they can go and search for an interpreter, a Sotho interpreter for the policeman, because they had assumed that he will be able to communicate in English. And so, so those are just some of the issues that I think of where when you're talking about the language of record being English only for police to be able to be the ones who are able to be eloquent in English, that it's not safe either to leave it to the policeman. Because I remember that even someone on Twitter, after you made that comment, they said that they were not allowed, they were told that in court, they were disallowed, they were not allowed to have an interpreter. They were not allowed to use their mother tongue, the indigenous language in court, in the South African court. And that's a problem. And then once again, there was this case when the burning of Parliament happened last year, and the interpreter that was available was a court interpreter, and yet mistranslated Xhosa. And so because I could understand is Xhosa, and there were other people in the legal who were also present in court, they also corrected the interpreter, even though the interpreter themselves, they are employed by the state to interpret. So I think here, there's just so many issues that have to do with language and justice. And so how much more then when we're dealing with a crisis like gender-based violence that implicates children, that's also specific to regional language, as as we discussed, that how children need to find a different language to explain what happened to them, to explain their trauma, and then when it's recorded, it may come out as something entirely different. And I think the paper that you wrote also referenced other countries such as Australia, and I think there's another country in Europe that you mentioned where the language of record, I think it's 2 languages. Is that correct? And yes, so Canada could it possibly been one of the solutions where the complainant records it? Can't the complainant record it in their own words? Because not everybody, children can't write. That would that be something that could be explored as part of a way of recording it, so where the person who is a complainant themselves is allowed to record it for themselves and have the police officer who, however inadequate their language might be, that they have to use, such as the English only policy in this case, then at least there's backup where there is evidence of what the complainant recorded.
Yes, no, thank you, Siki. To pick up on that last point you mentioned, my colleague, Dr. Annelies de Vries, and I are addressing this issue currently in terms of what you are saying, that there needs to be the complainant's original narrative and then a translated version into English, is what I'm understanding. We are looking at ways, and I hope Dr. de Vries doesn't mind me sharing this. We are looking at ways in how we can use technology to assist the police to say, can we have an oral recording and then it gets translated by a qualified translator, so we have that English only statement, but it's accurate then. So that's what we're trying to do, basically. That's just putting it basically. But obviously it's again navigating around the police's budgetary constraints. So as forensic linguists and two academics who are dedicated to improving the delivery of justice, we are trying to find the best option and the best solution available. This is one of the options we are looking at. We are also exploring other options with language technologists to say, how would an app perhaps work, or what is the best option going forward? And in terms of admissibility, it also means us working very closely with the judiciary and obviously Justice Umandisa Maya to say, what are the implications of what we are doing at Siki? That's also important. We have to think of that. We also don't want to take ill-informed decisions and create more chaos in a system that is already falling apart. But at the center of it, we want to focus on the complainant's voice being heard. And you know, this is very important to me, especially. A couple of years ago, we dealt with a case, State versus Sikafungana, which is here in Mount Frere in the Eastern Cape. And it was a very sad account of a lady who was deaf. And unfortunately, she had no formal education, so she couldn't use South African Sign Language. And she was raped, Siki. And I think it's relevant to our discussion today, you know, because of the gender-based violence issues you raise. And her sister and her actually formed their own language using signs and gesticulation and other forms of communication. It was very interesting to see. But, you know, that woman was silenced. And I mean silenced because the police took down the incorrect narrative that the sister had provided. The sister was Isxhosa speaking in a rural area who couldn't understand English. She couldn't reread that statement. There were a whole lot of complicating issues. There was a lapse in police investigation in terms of the sister saying that she had been raped. But the police understood it and wrote it down in the statement that she had been assaulted. So there was no evidence collected in terms of the rape. So there was nothing to prove that element and that charge. So it was dismissed. And he was a neighbor, in fact, which made it worse in the community that it was the perpetrator. And he was merely convicted of housebreaking and assault, common assault.
Wow.
Which, you know, when I hear of these gender-based violence incidents, it really goes to heart, because I immediately think of the case of Sikafungana and what happened there to this woman. And I think we just felt so helpless in a sense that, you know, we were not promoting this issue using this case, but we were communicating with her through her sister. And I think just to see her helplessness and hear the helplessness, even if we couldn't understand from her, and to know that in a sense, we were also helpless because we couldn't assist her in any way after that. And even interviewing the prosecutor and the magistrate, which we did after the case, and said, you know what, could you have brought in an intermediary? And when we look at section 170 of the Criminal Procedure Act, we know that intermediaries, besides your court intermediaries like Mrs. Van Wyk and Mrs. Jooste can be used, but also intermediaries in the sense of community members, because her sister could only communicate with her. She was unable to even provide her oral narrative in court. This woman, that's why I said she was silenced in a sense. And the prosecutor didn't think anything wrong with this, neither did the magistrate at the time. So, you know, you can just see the issues throughout the criminal justice system happening. And this case was a real good one in that sense, that exposed these issues. And I think this is what we need to be doing. We need to be vocal about these issues. And, you know, Siki, what worries me now is that we have a new complication in South Africa with emojis. And this is something that's about to hit us. It's currently unfolding in Australia, which is very similar to our jurisdiction in terms of language with Aboriginal people and so forth. It's unfolding in many international jurisdictions, and I think you are aware of this in France, in New Zealand, and other parts of Australasia. But I mean, emojis are now making appearance in criminal cases. Now, I am just thinking in the South African context, we are just having trouble using other languages, other official languages, which are majority spoken languages in our courts. Now, what happens when we throw in emojis into this mix? Are courts even prepared to interpret this? And I mean, you know, how is this going to complicate the issue with the police? So when we saw this communication, if I can call it that, because I don't want to say it's a policy, the communication from the Western Cape SAPS commissioner, and I thought, so what happens if a complainant brings in a series of text messages, and these text messages are in the form of emojis? I mean, how is the police officer going to deal with this, Siki? And in other jurisdictions like Australia, you have Professor Georgina Hayden and other colleagues working in the field very closely with police officers, training them to say, from a forensics perspective, this is how you interpret an emoji. This is how you interpret emojis as part of text. As part of, so like your WhatsApp messages, as part of emails, as part of documents. And it's not merely about saying, oh, I received a gun emoji. So
Yeah.
it's a threat. You need to take into account, obviously, context and the nature of the relationship and the intention of the sender and all. But just within the South African context, this is really going to be a surprise for the courts, and I really shudder to think, how is it going to be dealt with? And I'm worried that complainants are going to police stations. I don't have facts, so I cannot prove this, but I'm worried this is already happening and people are being turned away. And this is something we obviously have to investigate. And it's not because I, for one, want to create more issues for the police. I want to ensure that these complainants, like I said, have access to justice and their voices are heard. This is something that is not happening with this current system, and it's something that we need to address. So while we're addressing these issues of the language of record and the police language policies and all our other linguistic issues that we are currently experiencing, on the side and parallel to this, we also need to start addressing the issues of emojis as part of the gender-based violence crisis in South Africa.
Are you saying that complainants have been turned away sometimes from reporting these?
I mean, I'm not saying that as a fact. I can't go on record and say, yes, I have the facts to say, and the statistics, 10 people were turned away from the Makanda police station. I cannot say that. But what I'm saying is, given our use of emojis and the research that I'm conducting on emoji usage in South Africa and our broader gender-based violence crisis, it's doubtful that people are not going into the police station with a series of text messages. I mean, but are people not afraid, maybe, Siki, to go in? Somebody said to me a couple of weeks ago, are you actually opening the floodgates? And I said, to what? So they said, well, you're encouraging people now to go in with their cell phones into police stations and say, oh, I got a series of emojis from somebody who's sexually harassing me. So I'd like to charge this person. So I said, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that this is something we need to consider. And if this is happening, then we need to be prepared to deal with this, because it is happening in other jurisdictions. And it doesn't mean that because it's happening elsewhere in the world, it's not going to affect us in South Africa. It is. And I think, again, it's going to be a complication for South Africa because we multilingual, we multicultural. So again, it's going to boil down to that interpretation cultural barrier where I'm sending you an emoji and we have different cultures, Siki, and you interpreting it differently. I mean, a typical example within the South African context would be the monkey emoji. When you send the monkey emoji to a Black person, how is that interpreted? Is that derogatory? Is that offensive in any way? If somebody was to send me bacon strips or the pig, would I be offended? In what context is it being sent? What is the intention behind it? We know there are different monkey emojis. We know there is hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil emojis, if anybody didn't take notice of that. And then there's just the monkey emoji. So it also depends on which one you're sending. What happens when you send an animal to a vegan person? What happens when you send a gun to, or a series of emojis. This is a case emanating from New Zealand. There was a series of threats made on social media by a student at a school. And in these messages that he posted online, it was a series of threats, written text, and then there were emojis that followed using the gun emoji. And the gun emoji was repeatedly used within all his online posts. And he threatened to shoot the other children in his school and the teachers. And following the repeated use of the gun emoji, he put the laughing face emoji with the tears running. So he said, no, that's why he put the laughing face emoji, because it was a joke. Well, unfortunately, within their jurisdiction, he was found guilty. So it just goes to show, but it depends on the jurisdiction, the interpretation of the emojis and so forth. I mean, there's a number of factors, and that is a big conversation to be had. But what I'm saying within the South African context, it's going to come. And unfortunately, at the moment, South Africa is ill prepared to deal with it.
Wow. I mean, it certainly sounds like we are on the back foot of this language, forensic languages discussion, and even as a profession, and maybe we should be leading it, given that we pride ourselves as a multilingual society that's has made 11 official languages, and yet we have not really invested in making sure that these languages are accessible, particularly for for justice. So I think Conrad here has raised his hand. So let me unmute him, and you can now speak, I believe.
Thanks, Siki. Zakeera, I missed the first part of your talk due to technical problems, which seems to be hounding us today. I just wonder, I mean, at the conference, at the ALASA conference, those court interpreters presented, or at least one of them, presented a pretty stunning case for that, an indictment really as to how language is understood by the courts and used in the courts. Did you talk about that at all?
I didn't refer specifically to that presentation, Conrad, that happened at ALASA, but I did address the issue of interpretation within our courts in relation to the police. I know that interpretation is a difficulty currently undergoing in South Africa, on the go in South Africa, my apologies. And I'm sure you're aware, Conrad, of the research and the chapter that's just come out. Annelies, was it last year? That Annelies and I co-authored, actually in going to the courts, and we did an online survey and also emailed interpreters and so forth, and actually did a survey asking interpreters what their difficulty is, what the challenges are, and what are also the successes that we can take and implement throughout the courts. So that is something that we did. That was a voluntary survey. What we are doing now, Conrad, and you can tell me if I'm answering your question or not. What we are doing now is looking specifically at each province individually, partnering with the National Prosecuting Authority, because we need them on our side, obviously, and they need us, and the Department of Justice to say, let's look at the competencies of your interpreters to say, what are the language competencies of your interpreters? No, we don't want to offend anybody. We're not saying anybody must be fired or anything of that sort. We are saying, what can we do to train you? What are your qualifications and so forth? So that's what we need to do now on a provincial basis to assess, and then go back to the Department of Justice and the NPA to say, these are the shortcomings of interpretation. These are the successes, and this is what we need to do and what we need to build on. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question.
Well, yes and no. Perhaps what really struck me about what they presented was the dilemma with court interpreters face when they know what a victim is saying, but the court does not permit them to interpret meaning.
Yes. Okay.
For example, the one example being hy het my mooi gemaak.
Yes, yes. So that's exactly what I think you were also a part of that legal linguistics workshop last year, Conrad, where Fiona and Aldine exactly said that. And this is an issue, but this goes beyond just a policy issue. I mean, this goes to rules of court and the role of the interpreter, the role of the intermediary to say, I'm in a sense, as an interpreter, filling a cultural gap, and Siki and I did discuss this here at the beginning, so you might have missed that, to say it's not the role of the interpreter to transfer meaning, but in a sense it is, because that is the issue of word for word translation, because you are transferring, in a sense, within South Africa, from one culture to another. And this is what a monolingual language of record policy does. It constricts the interpreter, because now the interpreter is unable to say, actually, no, I understood it like this, but I know this is what the witness intended to say. The interpreter can't go and put his or her words there, even if they knew what the complainant or what the witness was saying in court. I hope that answers the question now.
Yes, thank you.
I would like to, is there anyone else who would like to engage the topic? Please raise your hand. What would you say is the quickest thing that can be done immediately by the police department? Because the police also are connected to the courts, the South African courts, and what needs to happen? What's the first thing that needs to happen in order to ensure that there is justice for people who speak different languages? Because you can't rely on police, because police themselves are not all first language speakers, English language speakers, and they may record whatever's being spoken completely differently to what transpired.
Okay, so I think for me, Siki, the first recommendation in terms of the police would be to meet with us. And I know Conrad has made this invitation public, to say, meet with us as experts working in the field. Like I said, let's hear what your internal issues are. Let us tell you about the research that's already being conducted, because that's another thing. There's a lot of oversight and repetition where research has already been conducted in the field, but is either being overlooked or intentionally ignored. And I think it would mean us having to have a conversation with the police, with the ministry, because we need this to be a ministerial issue that's addressed, to say to the minister, meet with us as forensic linguists, let's hash out a new policy, let's see if it works, and let's start piloting it in areas where there are majority spoken languages other than English, and see how it works. Okay, because we run a pilot, Siki, doesn't mean it's going to be successful the first time around. As I said, there will be issues, but it doesn't mean that the entire project would have failed. In a sense, it means us going back and saying, okay, what was the issue? Let's address it. In South Africa, we've got this notion in our minds that when something fails, we just put up our hands and we say, okay, well, we tried, it's over, it's done, let's give up now. And I don't think that can be our approach to language. We're talking about our cultures. We're talking about our identities when we talk about our language, and we are excluding people on the basis of language, and not in a community sense. We are excluding people from accessing justice, and this is serious. And so, for me to answer your question, that is the first port of call. It's also going to be to see how the police take to what Dr. De Vries and I are coming up with. In terms of a solution for them, to see if it's going to be implemented. And I think that will be the true test of whether the South African police actually want to ensure access to justice, to the criminal justice system, is improved, or whether they're just completely uninterested in addressing these problems. So I think it's a wait and see scenario.
Thank
Siki,
you.
if I may.
Yes, you may, but there are other people that have written
Oh, okay, no,
that
fine. No, I'll defer.
I'd like to read just some of what's been said here. Someone said, Indipiwa said, having to understand South Africa as what it really is, how can we differentiate between emojis used as a mere joke and emojis meant to harm, or send a hateful message?
Okay, that's a really good question. Thank you, Indipiwe. So in terms of how do we decipher that? So you'll have to look at a number of factors. Okay, you can't base it obviously on one text message. You need to look at a series of text messages or emails or documents that were sent to you that were harmful or hateful. You need to look at the specific emojis that were used. Okay, how do we interpret those? Where you have those crying, laughing face emojis afterwards, I mean, if that is continuously happening, but the nature of the relationship is volatile, then obviously that is contradictory. And there is foreign and international case law which can serve as precedent for us in South Africa. So it's not like we're going into this scenario blind. And South African courts can rely in terms of the law on international and foreign case law where we don't have that knowledge. So there are cases in the US where this is proved. A lady kept on getting threatening text messages from her ex-husband, okay? And what happened there is she took it to the police station and she charged him, and it ended up in court. I'm just giving you the short end of it. And he said, no, he was just joking with her. But she had a protection order in place. The nature of their relationship was abusive over a period of time and so forth. I'm not saying that complainants must first wait to be physically or emotionally abused. I'm not saying that before they should go and open a case. I'm saying that you need to present all the facts and the evidence. So as with any other charge, it will be based on evidence. And in this scenario with the emojis, you'll have to take into account the nature of the relationship, the intention of the sender. And in Indipiwe, remember, you must also take into account the different devices. Remember, emojis look different on Apple devices as they do to Samsung devices, for example, as they do on Google or on WhatsApp. So those are all factors that need to be taken into account. But obviously, as you would know, Indipiwe, a forensic linguist is best placed, who's working in the area, to come and be an expert witness to assist the court to ensure that the complainant gets the best outcome of the case. I hope that answers your question.
Esther, also, would you like to speak? Because I know that you had your hand up. Esther?
Yes.
Please speak.
Thank you, Siki, and thank you, Zakeera. That is such a fascinating input from you. I'm just wondering, it seems to me that a lot more research needs to be done into miscarriages of justice because of the language issue. I don't know if that is on the agenda of the forensic linguistics group, whether we could perhaps, apply for funding to get some master's students and honors students to research in different provinces, examples of justice not being served because of a language issue, either at the charge station or during interpretation in court. That's the first comment. The second is, I wonder if you have any knowledge about what's happening in countries like India, which are hugely multilingual, and what happens in the local courts, because I know they have many levels of court justice in India. And there's so many dialects, 22 official languages. So what is the policy there? I've now become very curious to go and do some research on this on Google.
Okay, you're cutting off. I think we've heard your general question. We can no longer hear you. Would you like to answer that, Dr.
Yes, let me respond. Esther, thank you very much for your support and your questions. With regards to the Forensic Linguistics Network, I think we have quite a few colleagues here, Corinne Brits and Annelies de Vries as well. So what we are doing, we have MA students and honors students currently. I think it's about 20, if not more, currently working with us. Ndipiwe, who's just left, is an honors student, or should I say a master's student now, and so is Aliziwe Siddiqui, who's tuned in. We also have students working specifically in areas of the police. And it's going to be interested, they're mainly based, Esther, within the Eastern Cape. So it's going to be interesting to see what research comes from there. It's also, as you know, it's about expanding the network. And because there's so few of us that are supervising in this area in South Africa, it makes it difficult for us to take on more students than we can possibly handle, but we are trying our best to do so. We also have students working in the area of emojis. I had a student, an MA student who graduated, Piwo Yase, that looks specifically at emojis and how we interpret it. And she actually came up with an app or a suggestion for an app called Emoji Translate, based on something that's already in existence in foreign jurisdictions, to say how can we use that within the South African jurisdiction, and how would it be complicated by the use of other languages that don't belong to the same language group. And I'd be happy to disseminate that research with anybody who's interested. We also have, I also have a student working with deaf persons, looking specifically at language usage within the court for deaf witnesses. And this was sparked by the incident I shared of Sikafungana. And this student in particular is a high court interpreter, a deaf interpreter, and she's a Xhosa mother tongue speaker. So it's going to be interesting to see what's coming out from her research. And then we also have other students working within pockets within the police, looking at specific police translation and so forth. So we are trying our best, Esther. We are spreading ourselves very thin, but we welcome any opportunity to collaborate and to take to develop this discipline in a sense, and to work with colleagues who have an interest in this specific work. I hope I answered it. Oh yes, and then you had a question about India. Yes, obviously India sparked my interest. It did form part of my PhD essay, and it is in my book. So India is monolingual in terms of their court system, very similar to us. And as you suggest, it's a multilingual country. What I also found about in India was very interesting is that the caste system, as you would know, Esther, heavily influences the language policy there. So that was an interesting fact for me. There was interesting research that I documented from not language practitioners, legal practitioners, to say, do you find it constricting to use English only in courts? And in fact, the majority of legal practitioners supported that English only policy, because they said there's so many different dialects in India, and there's so many official languages. It also depends in which part of India. I found that in some parts of India, some provinces in India, in the lower courts, the local indigenous languages were used. But I'd be happy to share that chapter that appears in my book with you on that research. Siki, I hope I answered Esther's questions.
I believe you have, and I also think it's time for us to land our conversation, because it was supposed to be an hour only, and I think we have now satisfied that hour. I just want to thank you so much for everybody who was able to jump on to Zoom, and that we're able to continue this discussion and I think we've succeeded, you know, against all odds. And I am very thankful to you, Dr. Zakeera Docrat, for that you were calm and you were able to answer all the questions and really have this really important discussion. And I personally believe that we need this discussion again, because it is a crucial one for our country, and particularly I think with our GBV crisis, as it is, we really can use more expertise, and we certainly need to make it more possible. And I think Conrad here has got his hand up. So let him speak before I land a conversation before one more important point is made. Please, Conrad.
Yeah. Okay, Siki, just to get to the activist component here, we have written to the Commissioner of Police of the Western Cape, who hasn't responded. I know he's read the letter because I have an automatic response thing built in. Also to the Commissioner of Community Safety, who did respond very quickly and was very interested. So I think we can follow up with a meeting, at least with him, and continue knocking on the door of the Commissioner.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Please say your last words just to wrap up the conversation, Dr.
Thank you very much, Siki, and thank you to ILAF for hosting this platform in celebration of Human Rights Day tomorrow. And colleagues, thank you for having to switch between platforms. And once again, we apologize for what had happened. I appreciate your engagements this afternoon and for you tuning in. It really means a lot to us as the Forensic Linguistics Network. I'm not only representing myself, but also colleagues here who are on this platform and who are unable to join us. And really, if you see something in the media, if there's something that sparks your interest, please do share it with me. I think most of you have my contact details. If not, please go through ILAF and share it with me. I'm happy to collaborate. Please join us in this fight. We need to be collective in our approach to say, let's include our African languages. And I think as soon as we take ownership of the languages as our own in South Africa, as soon as we start referring to the African languages and Afrikaans as our languages and not their languages, we will start to win this battle. We need to be united in the front and the fight against the South African police, but also, and the Department of Justice, but also to say to them, we don't only want to criticize and fight, we also want to say, let us help you. We are here to assist. So let us work together collectively to use and promote and advance our 11 official languages equally in South Africa. That's all from me. Thank you very much, Siki, once again.
Thank you very much. We will certainly host you again, and we hope that you'll be available, and we're so thankful that you've made yourself available, because we know that you have a lot of work in your hands. Thank you so much to everybody who's participated. We really appreciate you, and we hope that you will spread the message. We will be posting this on our social media as soon as I'm able to download it, and I'm grateful that we've been able to record it. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again. Please join us again on our next conversation on Indigenous languages. And if you do have a topic you'd like to discuss with us, please send us an email or DM us, and we will be happy to host you. Thank you very much, and please have a wonderful Human Rights Day. And thank you once again to Dr. Docrat for all your work. It is absolutely important. Thank you.
So much, Siki. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.